Hello and welcome to lecture number 11. Today we'll talk about an era described by many as a rebirth in interest in classical civilizations of the Greeks and Romans. Often, the French word Renaissance is used to identify this age. There are a few themes to be addressed in this presentation. First, we'll define a few terms, the term Renaissance as well as humanism. Then we'll explore some of the factors that influenced the start of the Renaissance and its spread. Lastly, I'd like to identify the actions or the works of four major artists and how their work was influenced by the ideas of the humanists. So we'll begin with some intellectual history and define some terms. Many scholars identify the Middle Ages as the so-called Dark Ages because there was less interest in arts and letters, where they were so-called neglected or maybe even dead for a few centuries. Well, the word Renaissance can actually be translated to mean rebirth. The rebirth here was a renewed interest in the successes and the accomplishments of the ancient Greeks and Romans. In the 1300s, a literary movement called humanism became quite popular and influential. This movement stressed that science or rational thought should be used to explain things in the natural world, whether you're looking at the creation of the Earth and the universe or how the solar system operates. In the past, there was one entity that answered all of these questions, and that was religion. Members of the clergy would answer those questions. Humanists began to question the ideas and the teachings of the clergy. One of the leaders of this humanist movement was Petrarch. Some actually call him the father of humanism. So one trait of the humanists was that they used rational thought to try to explain things. Petrarch was a writer and a teacher. His goal was to educate students as best he could to lead successful lives and to contribute to society. He couldn't find many role models in the time period where he was living, so what he began to do was he began to study the great civilizations of the past, the Greeks and the Romans, and this began to influence this intellectual movement. At the same time, Petrarch's ideas were influencing literature. A new piece of technology helped those ideas to be spread much more quickly than they had in the past. For hundreds of years, it was incredibly costly and time-consuming to produce written works. On the right, we see an image of a vellum Bible. These were Bibles that might take 170 calf skins or 300 sheep skins to produce. These were amazing works of art. Well, it might take someone a year to produce one of these vellum Bibles. In the mid-1400s, a new piece of technology, the printing press with movable type, was perfected. Johannes Gutenberg, shown here on the right, played an important role in the development of the printing press. Some historians have argued that it's impossible to overestimate its importance. It could be used in a variety of ways. It was a useful tool to unify diverse groups of people. It also impacted education and literacy rates. Once the cost of a Bible went down, people could then read it for themselves and interpret it for themselves. This had a huge impact on Western civilizations. On the left, we see an image of what Gutenberg's first printing press must have looked like. On the right, we see page 1 of Gutenberg's Bible. This is from the first book of Genesis. Next, we'll explore some aspects of Renaissance literature. On the left, we see a statue of Niccolò Machiavelli. He was an Italian politician and scholar. His most famous work was The Prince. It's important because this was the first rational explanation of politics. You may be familiar with the phrase, "the ends justify the means." This often is associated with Machiavelli's writings. Machiavelli also wrote The History of Florence. His History of Florence was written in the 1520s, but it wasn't published until after his death in the early 1530s. This revolutionized historical writing. In the past, many historical books had simply described events that had happened. This happened, and then that happened, and then that happened. Well, what Machiavelli did was he explored causes and consequences of events, not a simple recitation or regurgitation of dates and events. Next, we'll look at the Renaissance in Florence, Italy, and some characteristics of it. Today, we think of Italy as one country. Well, in the 1300s and 1400s, it was divided into several different city-states, and you can see them with the different colors shown here on the map. Florence, Milan, the Papal States, Naples, and Venice were all different city-states within Italy. The key city-state for the Renaissance was Florence, and it's shown here, in the northern portion of the Italian peninsula. Many artists from Florence began to include new themes in their artwork. First of all, we see the influence of humanism when subject matters that were common in Greek and Roman art began to be used once again in these Renaissance works of art. We also see scientific or mathematical themes, particularly the use of linear perspective. This was a mathematical system which helped to create the illusion of space and distance even though they were working on a flat surface, and the image on the right helps to show this. Finally, even though there were a lot of Greek and Roman subject matters, the Catholic Church in particular had a lot of money. Therefore, there were a lot of religious symbols in the artwork as well. There are 4 Renaissance artists I'd like to focus on. These would be Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Yes, these are the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. However, the reason why they have these names is because of the great contributions these artists made during this era of the Renaissance. Now that we've looked at some intellectual trends and how ideas spread in some literature, I'd like to address now some actual works of art. We'll begin by studying Donatello. What you will want to do is you'll want to be able to identify these 4 major Renaissance artists and some of their major works. The first would be Donatello. He was famous for his sculpture. He was influenced by Christianity as well as the Greeks and Romans. Some of his major works were David and Guatemala. Here we see a photo of St. Anthony's Basilica located in Padua, Italy. In front of this basilica is a famous statue called Guatemala. This is a close-up of the statue. Notice how this rider on the horse seems to be a figure in motion. He's not rigid or stiff. This is particularly noticeable when you look at the front hooves of the horse. These images from the ancient world can be used to contrast Guatemala. On the left, we see a figure from Mesopotamia. Notice his hands. Look at the figure on the right. Look at his hands. They're in fists. They're very rigid and they're standing still. Again, we're back to Donatello's work. It's a figure that's in motion, not rigid. This is also important because it demonstrates the synthesis or the combination of religious themes, it's in front of a basilica, along with classical themes. Now the classical theme here is that this is the first equestrian statue that was created since before the fall of the Roman Empire. This was completed in 1450. This is another famous work by Donatello. Can you tell who it is? Can you kind of give a profile of this individual or this figure? This work also was created about 1450, and it's Donatello's interpretation of a key figure in the Old Testament. It's David from David and Goliath. He's shown here and he's kind of young, and he's just killed Goliath. You can see the head and the helmet of Goliath at his feet, but he also seems to have some feminine features, particularly if you look at his face. Here we see David from a range of angles. It's about 5 feet tall, and it was the first large nude figure since antiquity. The circled area shows the head and helmet of Goliath, and Goliath's helmet has a feather that goes up the leg of Donatello. Once again, we see Donatello's David from the front. We'll contrast his interpretation of David with another a little bit later in this presentation. I'd like to show a couple of paintings by Botticelli. This is the birth of Venus. According to Greek mythology, Venus was born when the severed genitals of Uranus were cast into the sea. Here we see Venus floating ashore on a scallop shell. Here we see another painting by Botticelli. This is the Pietà. Pietà is Italian for either pity or compassion. And this shows the body of Jesus after he was taken down from the cross. He's in his mother's arms. Notice this interpretation of Mary. She's probably about 45 or 50 years old. The next artist to explore would be Leonardo da Vinci. Whereas Donatello was known as a famous sculptor, da Vinci was a painter. He was also influenced by science and Christianity. His most famous works include The Last Supper, the Mona Lisa, and a series of sketches. Here we see Da Vinci's interpretation of The Last Supper. It's one of the most reproduced images in all of art. Jesus is at the center, and he's just announced that one of the men who were at the table were going to betray him. The Last Supper is famous for its use of linear perspective, so I'm going to go back to that painting again here in a minute, and I'd like you to keep in mind the idea of the vanishing point and how balance can be achieved in a painting. Okay, so the vanishing point in this painting is the figure of Jesus. He's right at the center. But we also see balance in the painting. From left to right, we see each of the disciples. They're organized in groups of 3. Each is circled on the painting. Here's a close-up of Jesus. To Jesus' left, or our right, is Thomas. Jesus has just announced that one of the disciples is going to betray him. Well, Thomas is shown here saying, "Hey, I don't agree with you. This isn't going to happen." If you remember, after Jesus rose from the dead, according to Scripture, Thomas wasn't there, and Thomas didn't believe the disciples. And so here, Da Vinci is trying to tell a broader story of the New Testament within this single painting. This is a touched up version of the painting because it just has deteriorated over the years. The circled area here shows that one of the disciples had a knife in his hand. Again, this is foreshadowing something that would happen. Peter, later in the evening, would cut off the ear of a Roman soldier, and so he's shown in this painting with a knife in his hand. He's getting ready to use that knife later on. Da Vinci created a series of sketches, some of which focused on the human body. At times he would exhume human bodies, and he would look at the different muscles, the veins, and different pieces of human anatomy in order to be as realistic as possible when he painted his different images. Here's another sketch. This is actually a drawing that he produced that's kind of like a helicopter. Another of Da Vinci's great works is shown here. It's the Mona Lisa. Most portraits of this era showed a person's head and shoulders or their full body. Here we see a 3/4 view of the subject. It allows the Da Vinci to show nature in the background as well as the portrait of an individual. I was lucky enough to travel to Europe several years ago, and I was able to see the Mona Lisa. It's located at the Louvre. There was a huge crowd of people in front of it. I'm not a big one for selfies, but do you like my selfie on the right? The next key artist to study would be Michelangelo. He was a famous painter and sculptor. He was influenced by science as well as Christianity. His works include the Sistine Chapel, his interpretation of David, and the Pietà. The Sistine Chapel is located at St. Peter's in Rome, and here we see creation, one of the more famous images in the Western tradition. Here we see two close-ups from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. On the left, we see God from creation, and on the right, we see the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The Sistine Chapel is well known, but a more impressive work of Michelangelo's would be his interpretation of David. It was over 13 feet tall. It clearly glorified the human form and the perfection of the human body. I don't know if you remember this slide from earlier in the semester, but the Olympic Games were held in honor of Zeus by the Greeks, and they celebrated the perfection of the human body. What Michelangelo did was he was demonstrating the influence of the ancient Greeks in his artwork, even though he used a form from the Old Testament. I wanted to show this because it shows the two interpretations of David and contrasts the two. On the left, we see Donatello's David, who's younger, who's already defeated Goliath. On the right, we see Michelangelo's. He seems a little bit older, and he's contemplating what he has to do. This is before David fought with Goliath. Today, Michelangelo's David is located in a museum. Originally, it was placed outside, right in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, or the town hall in the city of Florence. Today, a copy of the original is in that location. Let me tell you, it's pretty darn impressive. Also in the city of Rome is Michelangelo's interpretation of the Pietà. This is the best photo I could have when I traveled all the way to Rome. I think you can see more detail with this one. Again, this shows Mary holding the body of Jesus. It's kind of a unique interpretation, wouldn't you say? Look at Mary's face. Here's a close-up of Mary. Does this look like the face of a woman who has a son in his 30s? It's a unique interpretation on the part of Michelangelo. Again, we're back to this view. It almost looks as if we've got a young mother holding a child in her arms, not an adult. Once again, I'd like to contrast two interpretations of the same scene. On the left, we see Botticelli's interpretation of the Pietà, while Michelangelo's is on the right. Two great artists, two different interpretations of the same scene. The last artist of focus would be Raphael. He was a painter. He was influenced by science, Christianity, and the ancient Greeks. His works include the School of Athens, and he was known for his Madonna and Child. This monumental work, the School of Athens, is considered to represent the culmination of Raphael's harmony with classical Greek philosophy. Several philosophers are shown here. They're representing the leading schools of ancient Greek philosophy, and they're assembled in one location. Once again, I'd like to go back to this slide, which focuses on linear perspective. In just a second, I want to show balance and the vanishing point in the painting by Raphael. The vanishing point is in the middle of this painting. That's where the first arrow is pointing to. We also see different groupings of philosophers throughout this room. On the right and left, we also see statues. Notice the balance that's demonstrated throughout the entirety of this painting. Here's a close-up of that vanishing point. It shows Plato and Aristotle. In a way, Raphael was showing homage to the painter Leonardo da Vinci, as this is actually a portrait of Leonardo shown here on the left, with his finger pointing in the air, which is something that Da Vinci did in many of his paintings. Here are some additional close-ups. On the left, we see Plato and Aristotle. On the top right, we see Heraclitus. This is actually a portrait of Michelangelo. And on the bottom right, we see Pythagoras. He's working on one of his theorems. Once again, we see the painting in its entirety. The arrow here is pointing to one individual who seems to be holding the world. It's actually a self-portrait of Raphael himself. Raphael was also famous for the tenderness that he showed in his paintings of Mary and Jesus, and we also see here John the Baptist when he was just a couple of years old. This is the Alba Madonna. We know this is Mary. She's often shown in blue. The title of this work is The Virgin and Child with John the Baptist. Once again, Mary is shown in blue. That just about wraps it up, but I'd like to review a couple of main topics first. Well, today we focused on the era of the Renaissance. Europe experienced a rebirth in the 1300s and 1400s. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to write an essay that defines humanism and explains a few things. First of all, its impact on the Renaissance. Secondly, how the ideas of the humanists were able to spread so quickly. And then, the impact of the humanists on the art and literature of this era. Well, that's it for today. There's only one more lecture left for our class. Have a good day, and we'll see you soon.